entry via an alternative route, provided that route does not gain them an unfair sporting advantage and does not endanger another rider. Marquez's path involved a brief stretch on the grass, but he reached the pit lane entry at the legitimate point where the entry begins. Crucially, race direction noted that no other rider was endangered by his trajectory. Every rider who could have been affected had already passed the crash site or was further back on the lap. The advantage Marquez gained from the shortcut is harder to quantify. By taking a more direct line to pit entry, he saved time compared to completing the full lap to the conventional entry. But the bigger advantage was the timing. By pitting on that lap before the rain reached its heaviest peak, Marquez was on his wet weather bike at exactly the moment the conditions made wet bikes the only viable option. Other riders who continued for one more lap crashed in the increasingly impossible conditions. The result is that Marc Marquez's crash on slicks may have been the single luckiest moment of his entire MotoGP career, because it forced him to pit at exactly the right moment. Zarco's reaction. This is exactly why Johann Zarco is angry. The Frenchman, who started second on the grid and finished the sprint outside the points after the chaos, told Motorsport.com his honest opinion of what happened. If there is no penalty, it's honestly very strange. Then people will say he knows the rules better than anyone else, but I don't think so. He just had a lot of luck. For me, he shouldn't win the race, but we'll see what the stewards decide. He took a big risk. Otherwise, he would have come in one lap too late. Maybe he would still have been faster than the others, but without winning. Because to win or be on the podium, you had to pit one lap earlier. I think he shouldn't win this race because his decision was already made. I'll maybe come in next lap, then he crashes and says, okay, I'll go into the pits. Normally, that shouldn't be possible. That is one of the most direct, on-the-record criticisms of a race direction decision in modern MotoGP history. And Zarco is not the kind of rider who throws accusations lightly. The counterargument. The counterargument, which is the one race direction effectively endorsed by not investigating, is that Marquez did not break any regulation. He used the official pit lane entry. He did not endanger the most controversial sprint victory in modern MotoGP history. Marc Marquez crashed during the Spanish Grand Prix sprint at Jerez and won the race. Let that sentence settle for a second. The reigning world champion fell at the final corner on lap 8, picked his bike up off the gravel, cut across the track, briefly rode on the grass to reach the pit lane entry, swapped onto his wet weather bike during one of the most chaotic mid-race rain showers of the modern era, and emerged from the pit stop in a position to fight for the lead. 3 laps later, he passed his factory teammate Francesco Banagna for the win. The result moved him to within 24 points of championship leader Marco Bezzecchi. The crowd at Jerez gave him the loudest reception of the day. Race direction did not investigate the incident, and Johann Zarco, who finished 8th in the same race, said publicly that Marc Marquez should not have won. This is the story of one of the most controversial sprint victories in modern MotoGP history. Let us get into exactly what happened, why Marquez was not penalized, and what this win means for the championship. The conditions. Start with the conditions. Danger anyone. The fact that his crash positioned him perfectly for the rain timing was lucky, but luck is not a penalty offense in MotoGP. Riders make instinctive decisions in chaotic conditions, and race direction has historically been reluctant to penalize riders for opportunistic decisions made within the letter of the regulations. If the rule book did not explicitly forbid what Marquez did, no penalty applies. There's also the moral question of whether Marquez actually crashed deliberately to engineer the perfect pit timing, which is the implication some critics have made. The answer is almost certainly no. Crashing deliberately at the final corner of Jerez is a remarkably risky way to set up a strategic pit stop, given that he could just as easily have hurt himself, broken the bike, or ended up in a position where the pit entry was not accessible. The far more likely explanation is that Marquez crashed because he was on the wrong tire for the worsening conditions, recovered fast because that is what he has trained his entire career to do, and made an instinctive decision to take the most direct route to pit lane because that is what his racing instincts told him to do. The result was a victory. The decision was reactive, not premeditated. What this means for the championship. Now, what does this mean for the championship? Marc Marquez closes the gap to championship leader Marco Bezzecchi to 24 points. That is a significant improvement on his 36-point deficit heading into the weekend. Bezzecchi crashed in the same sprint after a poor start caused by his rear tire spinning on a tear-off, dropping him to 17th before he eventually fell in the wet. He failed to score. Jorge Martin was running third early on before retiring with a brake fire on his Aprilia. Aprilia, the dominant team of the opening rounds, suffered a nightmare sprint with both factory riders out of the points. Pedro Acosta, third in the championship coming into the weekend, also failed to score. The chaos has narrowed the championship significantly. Bezzecchi remains 4 points clear of Martin in second. Marc Marquez is now 24 points off the lead. For Marquez specifically, this sprint victory is the biggest psychological boost of his 2026 season. He came into Jerez carrying a shoulder injury, riding cautiously, struggling with a Ducati GP26 that the entire factory team has been finding difficult to extract performance from. He left Saturday afternoon with 12 championship points and his first sprint victory at his home Grand Prix in years. Whether the pit lane entry was clean, lucky, or controversial, the points are the points, and the points are what win championships. A precedent has been set. For race direction, the decision not to investigate is a precedent. The next time a rider in chaotic conditions makes a similar shortcut to pit lane, the Marquez-Jerez sprint will be cited as the case that established the rule. Either race direction will continue allowing creative pit lane entries during wet weather chaos, or they will adjust the regulations to prevent it from happening again. The Italian, Spanish, and French media are already debating which direction the sport should take. For Aprilia and the championship picture, Saturday at Jerez was the worst day of their 2026 season. Bezzecchi out of the points, Martin retired, the 5-race winning streak broken. The advantage they had built over 3 rounds suddenly evaporated in the rain. Sunday's Grand Prix is now a critical day for them to reset. If Bezzecchi has another difficult race, Marc Marquez could end the weekend within 15 points of the championship lead, which would fundamentally change the entire trajectory of the season. Saturday at Jerez began damp after rain in the morning. The track dried for the start of the 12-lap sprint, but dark clouds were gathering above the circuit by the time the lights went out. Marquez took the whole shot from pole position. Zarco held second. Alex Marquez worked his way past Zarco to second place by lap 2 and started chasing his older brother. By lap 7, Alex passed Marc into turn 7 and took the lead. Fabio Di Giannantonio was reeling in both Marquez brothers. Then the rain arrived, and it arrived with absolutely no warning at all. On the same lap that Toprak Razgatlioglu and Lorenzo Savadori collided in the wet, Marc Marquez crashed at the final corner, the curve named after Jorge Lorenzo. He had been on slick tires in conditions that were rapidly becoming impossible. He had also been losing pace, having been overtaken by his brother only minutes earlier. The crash itself was not particularly violent. Marquez slid off. The bike tumbled into the gravel trap and the race continued with riders dropping like flies behind him. Brad Binder of KTM was already heading for the pits. Bagnaia and Franco Morbidelli were following. The rain was getting heavier by the second. Where the controversy starts. This is where the controversy starts. Marquez picked up his Ducati. He waited for the pack to pass and then, instead of taking the conventional route back onto the racing line and continuing around to the standard pit entry, he made a decision that has now divided the entire paddock. He rode briefly on the grass, cut across the track, and reached the pit lane entrance via a shortcut that skipped a significant portion of the lap. By the time he was in the pit lane, less than 20 seconds had passed since the crash. He swapped to his wet bike, he rejoined the race. And from that point, with most of the rest of the front runners having either crashed or pitted later than ideal, Marquez found himself in a position to fight for the lead with 3 laps remaining. He overtook Bagnaia at turn 9 on the penultimate lap. He pulled away to win by 1.3 seconds. Morbidelli completed a Ducati 1-2-3. Binder, the early wet weather leader, crashed out of 4th and dropped down the order. The checkered flag flew on what is now being called the most bizarre sprint result in years. Race direction did not investigate. Why was Marquez not penalized? So why was Marc Marquez not penalized? The technical answer involves how MotoGP pit lane entry rules actually work. The MotoGP regulations require a rider entering pit lane to use the official pit lane entry. They do not specifically mandate the route a rider must take from the racing line to that entry. In practice, riders almost always follow the conventional path around the track from their position, but the regulations do not penalize a rider who reaches the official pit lane entry